Hey guys, welcome back to the TTA Performance YouTube channel. Today I want to get a video going about removing the turbo from the car. I've had some people that have emailed or called up and purchased an upgraded turbo or some kind of turbo component, and then they were asking, well, do I have any kind of instructions or service manual pages or anything that shows how the turbo comes off? So I thought I'd take an opportunity to show you all the little ins and outs of replacing the turbo, or at least removing the turbo from the car. I have a customer's car here right now. We have this gray 1980 Turbo 301 that we're going to be replacing the turbo. We're going to be upgrading the turbo on it. So we'll take a look at the engine. I'll point out all the little areas that you're going to have to, things that you're going to have to remove, things you're going to have to loosen, so on, for some of the areas that might be kind of difficult and challenging to take apart, and some of the things that you can actually maybe leave off while you're doing this type of work or this job. Also some of the things that you're going to want to replace while you're in there, because the turbo takes up a lot of room and it's blocking a lot of things. So let's take a look at this car and we'll get right down to it. Okay, so here we have this 1980 301 turbo. Somebody's already been in this, as you can tell by the valve covers that are painted a earlier Pontiac engine blue color. I received this car and kind of looked it over for the customer. It's got a stalling issue, especially when it's cold. Choke's not working. He wants it to perform better and perform like it should. But one of the first things that I also noticed was that the carburetor on this car is actually incorrect. Let's go over that real quick. I always ask for a part number for the carburetor. And when I do, what I'm talking about, and hopefully we can get kind of zoomed in there. It's kind of grainy. There you go. There's a part number right there on the carburetor. This one here being 17058278. It's either an 8 or a 3. The problem being that this is actually the 17058 number indicates that it's a 1978 carburetor. So obviously this is not the correct turbo carb. It looks like it's a reman unit too, with all the different screws in it and everything. So somebody had put this carburetor on it. It does idle and drive okay when it's warmed up. It's not going to be correct though for boost. The original carburetor came with the car, so we're going to rebuild that and put it on. But some other things that I was checking over is that this coolant hose right here, somebody made this. This is a coolant hose going to the plenum, and it's to keep the base of the plenum warm during cold drivability. So basically when the engine's warming up, they're actually heating up the bottom of the carb to get better cold drivability out of it. We'll go into this in a little more detail later as to how this operates and everything. But we're going to probably be replacing that hose while we're in there. And that's one of the items that has to be removed in order to take the turbo off. So since we're on this side of the engine, some of the things that we are looking at, and see if we can get some better view of it, maybe. So there is a bracket right here. This bracket bolts to the cylinder head. One is on the cylinder head stud, and then there's another bolt back here that is kind of going up on an angle into the cylinder head. Now we don't have to remove that, and in fact, in order to get that bracket off, this heat shield, which is really hard to see, this heat shield would have to be removed. But we're not going to take that bracket off. What we're more concerned about is the bracket where it bolts to the plenum. Now there's a bolt here, and then there's one behind it. There's two on the side, and you can see right now there is something loosely bolted on there. So what is loosely bolted on there? It is this switch. Now a lot of people ask me what that switch is for. That switch is a wide open throttle switch to kill the air conditioning at wide open throttle to make sure that you get all the power that you can. Now, if you have a car that switch is missing and your air conditioning does not work, it's because you have to jumper this connector. There's two green wires here. You have to jumper across that to complete the circuit to allow the AC compressor to kick on. So watch for that. But yes, when the car would go into wide open throttle, it would push that, it would break the connection, and it wouldn't, it would kill the AC compressor, the clutch on the AC compressor, so there's no drag on the engine. So this bracket is actually bolted, and we lost it there, okay. The nut right there, there's one behind it. Take those nuts off, this bracket comes off, then you can get at the bolts there. The bolts have a stud coming off the end of the head. So we'll take those two bolts out, and you should be able to get the turbo off without having to loosen this bracket. Now, over here, and you can see where this is the coolant hose that we were just talking about right here. That coolant hose is attached to the plenum. It's kind of hard to see because the vacuum hose is in the way. There is a clamp there, and it's just a hose barb connection. And like I said, when we get it all apart, go into more detail about the braided hose that I make that fits more correct. So yeah, that's going to have to come off. Now, with coolant coming in through the plenum at the bottom, that you got to have a return, and that's at the rear. And in this case, see if we can find it. It's hard to see. Let's see if I can get in there or not. It's maybe that's it right there. It's this hose right here. This hose is actually coming up, and it's following along the firewall behind the dipstick here. It is this hose right here, and you can see it goes into a metal line, and then that metal line actually comes around to a heater hose on the passenger side. So we're metal, and this is the hose right here coming down, wise into this. So this is a heater hose that is returning to the water pump. That's the coolant flow path for the plenum. And when I mean plenum, that is the piece that the carburetor bolts to. It is the transition piece that goes from the underneath the carburetor to the flange of the compressor housing of the turbo. So they're heating that, but it's only being heated when the engine's cold. We'll show more when the hose is off as to how it's getting its water flow, but that's one of the pieces that's going to have to come off. So yes, it'd probably be wise that we drain some of the coolant out of the radiator, get the level down lower so that we're not making a mess when we disconnect those coolant hoses. So now that we're on this side of the engine, some of the things, obviously, this is our downpipe. We're going to be unbolting this. In this case, this car is going to get my upgraded 2.5-inch downpipe, so we're actually going to be removing this pipe completely. Then we have our up pipe here. Now the up pipe, we unbolt it from the turbo. You can try to loosen the 3 bolts down here at the manifold. Sometimes they're stubborn and they rust up and whatever. Usually you can, with a little bit of flexibility in this flex joint, we can get the turbo off and leave that up pipe alone. If you're not replacing a down pipe or anything like that, yeah, you can finagle and get around the down pipe. Sometimes you can try to maneuver it and get it out of the way to make it easier to take it off. This bracket here, you're going to take, there's a bolt up front here, there's one in the back. You're going to unbolt that. That's a support bracket. Sometimes that's missing. Most of the time it's missing because the way it's mounted is on the intake manifold bolts. I kind of outlined this in the Richard Petty motor. The intake manifold bolts have studs coming off the heads of them. A lot of times what happens is either the turbo gets removed or the intake manifold gets replaced, and they don't put the studded bolts back in correctly. So when they go to put that bracket on, they find out that, oh no, there's no studs to hook this to, and then they just pitch the bracket and they don't use it. So it's good to see that that bracket is there. This big fitting right here, this is going to be your nemesis. This big fitting is for the EGR valve. This is, since there's no exhaust crossover to heat the base of the intake manifold, because we're doing it with coolant over there on the plenum, they took and took exhaust from this side of the intake, just this side of it, and they put this brass block on there. And that brass block has a rather large tube. We'll see if we can take a look at it or not, if we can get a good view of it. I think we can. it has this tube right here attached to it, and that tube winds around the back side of the turbo and comes up behind the plenum. It attaches to the back of the plenum underneath where the EGR would be. As you can see, this has our EGR block-off plate installed. So that is how the car was fed, or the engine was fed EGR, exhaust gas, was through that fitting. Now, you can leave the tube on the plenum side, but you have to loosen it and unscrew it from this side and actually get it out of the way. A lot of times that tube's going to twist. That fitting is supposed to turn independently of the tube. Sometimes it doesn't want to. Again, they get twisted. I've seen people cut them. I've seen people cut them, pinch them off, weld them, all kinds of stuff. That's usually, it's a 1 1/16 inch wrench, and it's a little hard to kind of get in there, but you can get at it. It's supposed to be loosened up and taken off. If it does loosen up and and can be removed, great. And usually that's the easy part. It's if you're trying to put it back on, that's where alignment is an issue. In fact, I wouldn't even tighten down the turbo until that was started and threaded, just to give me more movement. In this case, because the EGR has been deleted, we're going to delete this fitting, and we're going to put a plug in the intake manifold. We're going to leave that tube off. Other than that, some typical nomenclature. This is the compressor housing of the turbo. This is the aluminum side. That's the exhaust or turbine housing. This is the oil feed line up here, and we're probably going to be replacing it with my braided stainless steel one. This is just a hard bent line, so you have to bend it out of the way in order to get the turbo off, but that will have to be removed also. Wastegate actuator can stay on. The tube here for the wastegate, that can stay on also. Do you have to remove the carb? Technically, you do not have to remove the carb. I am going to, because it makes it a little bit easier to access things, and since it has to come off anyway because it's the wrong one, I'm going to remove it. This car, the fuel line will have to come off, of course. This one looks like it's been patched up, so we're probably going to replace that with my stainless fuel line. Other than that, you have all your vacuum hose connections. At the back of the carb, your throttle linkage. There's going to be a transmission kickdown cable linkage that's going to be underneath that. This does not look right. Somebody threaded something? I don't know what they did. Oh, they made their own little C-clip there. This throttle return spring is completely wrong too. But we're going to fix some of that stuff. That should, and then the only other thing that's really holding the turbo on besides the driver side bracket, the passenger side bracket, EGR tube, then you have your 3 bolts right here. There's the 3-bolt flange where it bolts right to the intake manifold. Take those off, and the turbo should lift and come out. Now, lifting it and coming out. The bottom, so we have the oil feed line at the top. There is a large tube on the bottom that is your oil drain that's draining into the valley pan of the engine. So when you go to take the turbo off, you're actually lifting, but you're lifting up and forward because it's on an angle. That tube is on an angle. So you're going to lift up and kind of forward to get the turbo off. So we're going to dig into it here. I'm going to start getting out the tools. And, it doesn't hurt to hose down some of the bolts with some rust penetrating oils and stuff like that. And then we'll get rocking on it and get it off. One other thing that I forgot to mention. This car, this engine, some bolts are metric, some bolts are not. It depends on where you're working. Most everything on the turbo is metric. Majority of the stuff on the engine itself is not. So for instance, the 3 bolts that are going around the up pipe to the inlet of the turbo, those are metric. The bracket that we talked about on the passenger side, those are metric. The 3 bolts going into the intake manifold holding the compressor on, those are not. You're going to want to have both metric and SAE tools available to you because you don't know what you're getting into as to which one is which, or if you're going to be on a metric bolt or not. So yes, it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's a transition year where some stuff was metric, some stuff was not, but have both tools on hand just in case. All right, so we got the turbo off, and customer wanted the valve covers painted with the Pontiac blue that he chose. It's an earlier color. But I wanted to show in detail about what's going on with the thermostat. Now, the thermostat that I pulled out of the car, it was actually the incorrect one. And this is what I'm talking about. So here's the correct thermostat that we sell. And you can see that it has this extra spring and plate on the bottom here. And I'll show you what that does in a second. So this is a 180 degree thermostat that we sell. And it's correct for the turbo car, and here's why. Inside, you'll see, and I'm probably dimming it, right down in the bottom, there's that little hole in the bottom. What we got going on is actually it's a pressed in steel cup, almost like a freeze plug with a hole in it. And that hole in the center, that hole in the center there at the very bottom is a passage to this, this fitting, the barb fitting. So you have this washer. Let's try to get this to focus. You have this washer on the bottom, and with the thermostat closed, that whole assembly is up all the way to seal off. And when you're sealed off, you're basically not allowing any coolant from the engine to go into the radiator, because we're trying to warm up. And so that washer sitting up is not sealed against that hole. And so there's a gap there. It's allowing coolant to come up through these passages, get by that bottom washer of the thermostat, through that hole, through this hose barb connection, and then there was a hose that went from here that ran to the plenum. So let's go over to the plenum. So here we have the plenum, and the plenum would have another hose barb connection here. Now I took it out because I sandblasted the plenum, but there would be another hose barb here, just like the one in the intake manifold. So water would actually flow through here with the thermostat closed, and then it would exit out the back here with this 3/8 hose connection. And like I detailed earlier in the video, you had the 3/8 hose going towards the firewall, which then teed into the heater hose that was returning to the water pump. So why are we doing that? Okay, thermostat is closed. The bottom of the thermostat is not sealing against the hole. It's allowing coolant to flow through the bottom of our plenum here. So the plenum is actually hollow inside. Not here. It's blocked off here. We don't have coolant sitting under here or sitting in here. We have coolant that is actually below this surface. And what we're doing is we're heating up this chunk of aluminum, basically, only when the thermostat is closed and the engine is trying to warm up. So we have warm water coming from the cylinder heads, going into here, returning back out to the heater hoses, and we're trying to get this warmed up so that the fuel that's coming in from the carburetor is atomizing. It's turning into a vapor. We don't want liquid fuel. And because if the fuel is not atomizing, if it's not turning into a vapor, it'll start puddling down in here. And you'll have raw liquid gasoline sitting in here. And then if you open the throttle blades and you allow more air into the engine, into the turbo, it will suck that liquid fuel in there and cause an over-rich condition, a lot of stumbling and black smoke out the exhaust possibly, and it'll run poorly. So we want to get this fuel evaporation going on, atomization going on. We want to turn it into, and that's why they heat it up. Now, what happens when the thermostat opens because we come up to our operating temperature? Once it opens, this valve part goes down. This comes down, this comes down, blocks off the hole in the intake manifold. We no longer flow coolant through the plenum. So the plenum is only going to get to a certain temperature, and that's it. We're not going to flow any more water through it. We're not going to keep heating it up. But if you put the wrong thermostat in it, if you put a thermostat, a regular conventional thermostat, which does not have this spring and washer on the bottom, that hole is always open. So you're constantly flowing hot water through here, and you just keep increasing the temperature, and this always stays hot. What does that do? I mean, it's going to help with the fuel, evaporation and everything, but hot air going into a turbo that's compressing the air and making it even hotter is just going to get you that much closer to detonation. So we want it to be cool, but we don't want it to be so cool that the fuel can't turn into a vapor. I have customers, and I've heard of people that will disconnect this and they won't run coolant through the plenum. Maybe in a very warm temp environment, if you're southern states, Florida, Texas, Arizona, things like that, you could probably get away with it. Does it gain performance? That's a question. I don't know if you really are gaining any performance. Maybe you are. I mean, cooler intake air temps will gain more performance. But at the same time, cold drivability suffers. Here in Wisconsin, we have cold temps, and as long as it's above freezing, usually I'll drive my car if the weather's nice and there's, if it's a sunny day and stuff. And I've had it with even the fuel injection cars that the fuel puddled in the bottom and caused all kinds of problems in cold temps. Because amazingly, if it's 45 degrees temperature out here, this stays pretty cold. It would take a while to actually get enough engine temp to transfer heat through the aluminum and actually heat it up eventually. So the drivability, especially from stoplights and stuff like that, kind of suffers, and it just runs poorly, starts fouling spark plugs and so on. I'm more of the person that would say run it, use it, have the correct thermostat in it, get that, keep that cold drivability available. I don't know how important it is or how much of a performance gain there would be if you bypassed it or removed the system entirely. But I say use it just in case you're in a cold temp someday. But that's how this all works. We're going to get the correct thermostat in this car. The hose itself, let's talk about the hose. The hose is no longer available. It was a pre-molded hose that went from the barb on the intake to here, and it routed around the EGR valve and behind the power enrichment valve and so on. You can't buy that hose anymore. It's no longer available. I don't even know if the aftermarket ever made that hose. I think it might have been a GM only deal. But I do have a solution for it. Let me get that for you. So this is my solution. This is a hose that I make. This is a AN style fittings on a black nylon braided hose with aluminum fittings. And how this works, and these are in here loose. This straight fitting will actually go into the plenum. The hose will curve around. This 90-degree fitting, we're going to place that in the intake manifold, and we're going to route the hose on there and connect the ends. If you're ever in the car or into the engine and you're doing like a turbo or anything like that where you can access that hose and you're not sure what was done, if it's the original hose or not, or the condition of it, might be a good idea for just some preventative maintenance to replace it. When you do install this 90-degree fitting, the thermostat housing has to be off because you can't get the rotation needed to turn the fitting in there. With the thermostat housing on there, it's going to hit. So, might as well do a thermostat at the same time. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take out that fitting, put the 90-degree fitting in there for this hose. We're going to put the thermostat in, thermostat housing on, and then we'll get the rest of it buttoned up with the turbo and everything. Just wanted to point that out to you guys. Next steps, I'm going to show the aluminum. I'm going to show the stainless steel oil feed line for the turbo, and also some tips and tricks of how I install a new turbo. So something else I wanted to talk about when we're dealing with the coolant hose and we're dealing with AN style fittings. Same thing goes for the oil line, which is much smaller. But let's see, hold this here. I'm trying to do this and hold the camera. So with the AN fitting, let's see, get some light on that. We have this flare end, and then we have a pipe thread end. So the pipe thread end, this goes into plenum. the 90-degree version, the elbow went into the intake manifold. And what you want to do with this is you could put pipe thread sealant, either liquid or tape, on these threads. Do not put them on this side. This side does not seal on the threads. This side seals on this flare right here. So no sealant is needed on these threads for the flared end, but you can put sealant on this side where it threads into the plenum or intake manifold, whatever has the pipe thread hole, pipe thread threads. That's what you want to do. So I want to show also the oil line. This is the turbo oil feed line that I sell. Stainless steel, flexible, nice piece. I recommend putting this on if you're putting a new turbo on. So there's, this is a fresh hose, originally from the factory, and it's not shown in this engine. It had a pre-bent metal steel line going from the turbo to the fitting on the back of the block. That metal line, you have to bend it out of the way to get the turbo off. If you're going with a new turbo, it's probably a good idea to replace it, just in case the old one's clogged up with, caked up oil or anything like that. So when you get this oil line, you're going to have a 90-degree AN fitting. It's an adapter. It has the pipe thread on one side, which again, you put thread sealant on these threads, not on the ones that the flare is sealing it. There's a 90-degree fitting on this that's attached to the straight end of the hose. The other side of the hose is a 90-degree fitting on the hose, but a straight adapter fitting for that. So the straight adapter fitting is actually going to go into the engine. Now this engine, the steel line is gone. It's already been removed, but it was a double flare originally. So this fitting is actually a double flare fitting from the factory, but it's in another adapter. So what you would do is you would remove your adapter here for the double flare, the original double flare. You're going to take that out, but you're going to leave this bushing, this reducer bushing in the block. And when you take this adapter out, it'll be an 1/8 inch pipe thread hole in this reducer bushing. And that's what this is going to fit into. So you put your pipe dope or whatever on the threads, and then you're going to screw it into the bushing there. It's pretty straightforward on the turbo side. You're going to unscrew this brass adapter for the double flare, and you're going to replace it with this 90-degree AN adapter, and then you're going to hook up your oil line. Pretty straightforward. All right, so we got the turbo starting to put it together here. We got the plenum bolted on. This is a stage 5 turbo, which basically looks identical to a stock turbo. It's just internally it's upgraded. So I've already, like I said, I bolted the plenum on. That's nothing unusual about that. You just want to make sure that it is clocked correctly, because you want the plane here to be parallel to the intake manifold. You can technically clock this and have it off, which it won't go on if you do that. So what we want to do next is, what I like to do is I like to loosen up the bolts. Let me get you in focus here. I like to loosen up the bolts that are going on the turbine housing, and then also loosen up these bolts for the compressor housing. And we want them to be a little bit snug. They don't have to be completely loose. What we can do then is actually clock this. So if you look, I can rotate and clock the turbine housing, and I can do the same thing. Whoa. I can do the same thing on here, which it's a little snug, so I can't really move it with one hand. You don't have to loosen these bolts. There's no need to do the small ones there. Leave those tight. You just want to loosen here on the compressor housing and on the turbine housing. It's going to be able to take this, what we call the center bearing housing, and we're going to be able to clock that independently from these housings. And the whole point of doing that is so that I can put it on the car loose, and I can get my brackets lined up, my flange lined up, bracket on this side, get all my holes and everything lined up where the turbo is settled onto the engine where it belongs. And then I'll snug up whatever bolts I can get to, take the unit back off the engine, tighten all the bolts. Now it'll drop right into place when I go to put it together. it is an extra step, but it's going to save you so much frustration, because sometimes these turbos, when they come back from the rebuilder, they're not necessarily clocked 100% where they need to be. And then you're fighting brackets and everything. And one of the bigger areas that you end up fighting is this oil drain tube. Now, we already have it bolted on. And this nut here is actually spins independent from the tube when you loosen it. It's kind of a double flare, almost like a brake line, but it's just really big. And I don't loosen this. I don't do anything with this. I unbolt from here with the flange and just leave it where it's at, because it is on a curve. It does have a curvature to it to fit into the grommet that's in the valley pan for the oil drain. Now, I've seen this thing cut and repaired with rubber hose, which is not good. But depending on if somebody ever loosened that nut, took it off, took the pipe off there. You know, I've seen some guys that when they went to pull the turbo off the engine, they actually unscrewed this to get the turbo off, not realizing that it's just slip fit into the rubber. So this kind of plays a part into the position when the turbo gets on the engine, where it's going to sit also. So that's why I loosen everything up, get it in position, get it where it's comfortable, so I'm not fighting everything. Get my bracket holes lined up. There's the other one, you know, on the intake manifold bracket, and you're good to go. It ends up saving you so much frustration. So I'm gonna, I got it all loosened up. I'm gonna go place it on the engine and then get everything where it needs to be, tightened up, and take it back off. So I'll show you how that works out. So here on the engine, we've got the oil line installed. So I have the bracket mounted on the intake manifold. We talked about that before. But what we're going to do, what I like to do is I like to leave this loose so it can float around for right now. So that can float there. I've got the coolant hose fitting screwed in there, got the thermostat in. I did have to remove the knock sensor. This is the knock sensor location for a 1980. We know it's a 1980. We have a power enrichment valve here, which has already been rebuilt in the past by me. When you install this 90-degree fitting for the coolant hose, I make it point right to the EGR fitting. So that's about the clock position you need for the hose for when you go to attach the hose. And it goes on and point in that direction. So we'll get the turbo over here and get to putting it on. So what I'm doing is I'm slipping the drain tube into the grommet first. Sometimes this is easier to do with two people than one. And you kind of have to find the right angle that it wants to drop in. But the weight of the turbo alone should allow it to go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so my fittings, this is not where I want it. We're gonna rotate that. Get the position going of what we want. And I'm gonna put a gasket under there because the gasket's pretty thick. So we're gonna slide our gasket underneath. What we could do is actually throw at least one bolt in it to get it to sit straight and where we want it to go. Nope, gotta go back more. There we go. Get that snug down when we want. Rotate this, see how this bracket fits. Yeah, I think it's going to be right about there. So we'll get the wrench. Snug up a couple bolts. I'm going to snug these up so that it doesn't rotate when you take it back off, obviously. So get that tight. The other one here. Can I get it that one? That should hold it in place. Take our bolt back out. And we'll take it off and tighten it on the bench. All right, so we got the turbo on, bolted up, it dropped right into place. All the bolts threaded in by hand because we clocked it and got it where we wanted it. So everything is tightened up. I wanted to show in detail, get this hose out of the way for the power enrichment valve, how the coolant hose is attached. So when you get the coolant hose, there is a 120 degree bend here, and then there's a 90 degree bend there on the hose itself. Note that they do swivel on the fitting on the hose side, both sides. So you can actually twist and move them and position them where you need. The straight fitting was put into the plenum, attach the hose. It gets a little tight and close, but this is why we have it bend the way we do. It's kind of going down towards the intake manifold, comes around, and of course attaches to the other side. Yeah, just kind of put it in place, leave everything loose until you get everything threaded by hand, and then snug and tighten everything up. Good to go. Got all the bolts, or all the bracket is tight and everything. Back there, we got the oil line fitting inserted and the oil line tightened down. I don't know how many times I've left that off or loose and had an oil leak. But now we're just gotta get the rest of the motor back together and get her fired up. So I'm gonna end the video here. Hopefully this helps you guys out for taking off and installing a new turbo. If you got any questions or anything like that, feel free to contact us through email, give us a phone call, anything like that. You can visit us at the website, TTAperformance.com. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.